Okay, so welcome to a quick intro session into poverty and development. This talk doesn't intend to replace your notes. It's an introduction into the key issues on the poverty and development course. So let's start with what those words mean. So poverty is the state of being poor. We're looking at countries which remain poor in relation to other countries. And development really is the process of becoming richer. So poverty being poor, development getting richer in simple terms. And I think it's good to start with a bit of a history lesson. If we go back 100 years, many countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America were owned by rich countries in Europe. This was called colonialism or imperialism. And these colonies were inevitably much poorer than the countries which ruled them. About 50 years ago, most of these countries gained independence. So let's take Zimbabwe and India as two examples. They both gained independence from Britain about 50, 60 years ago. And I guess we hoped and expected that independence would bring wealth to these countries, but that hasn't proved to have been the case. And in the last few decades, despite this being the wealthiest period ever known to man, and we have exceptional growth rates in the rich world over the last 30 years, many countries seem to remain stuck at the bottom. So the question remains of what can we do to help these countries to alleviate their poverty and to accelerate their development. So let's start with a couple of perspectives on poverty, on development. Firstly, the orthodox view, also known as the economic liberal view. Now this argument is that the solution to poverty is economic growth. They need improved GDP. And the mechanism for this is the free market. Essentially, we should allow the free market, we should allow the profit motive to flourish. Government should keep out of the way. This is called laissez-faire. So government step back and allow the free market to flourish, and this will help these poorer countries. So this view is associated with Thatcher and Reagan, the IMF, the World Bank, globalization, transnational corporations, all fall into this idea of the orthodox or economic liberal view of development. Then there's the alternative view, which is a bit more difficult to define. It's not quite as coherent. The two key themes here are that it is anti-capitalist and anti-globalization. It also tends to be more sort of community-based and might have social, cultural, environmental concerns, and also human rights plays a key role in the alternative view, but essentially anti-capitalist, anti-globalization. As we continue to understand poverty, let's look at the north-south divide. Now, we see a lot of these two-way splits on our course, and they're always a bit of an oversimplification, but that we can still learn something from the north-south divide. Now, the north-south model is the idea that there's a political division that exists between a social and economic and political division that exists between wealthy developed countries known as the north and poorer countries known as the south. Now, this isn't really supposed to reflect the world map. It's not about geographical positioning. It's simply the idea that the north is rich and the south is poor. And go back 50 years, the economic figures would seem to reflect this. So, for example, in the mid-20th century, Europe and America accounted for 90% of world GDP, and the rest of the world, despite having a far bigger population, only had 10%. So the north-south divide did seem to be a good way of looking at the world, but it's generally accepted that it's now broken down. It's too simplistic, and a key word that we often hear is interdependent. The world is far more interdependent now, rather than being able to be described in simple two-way black and white terms. Wolfenson, we've read his article recently, suggests that a two-tier world has been replaced by a four-tier world. We've seen the rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China. And there's a general view that now sub-Saharan Africa, that part of Africa below the Sahara, we're talking about middle and southern Africa, this part of the world is now seen as stuck at the bottom, while other parts of the world have enjoyed great prosperity in recent years. So what we've talked about so far is understanding poverty, and we can now look at different solutions to solving poverty. And one of the key arguments would be that a way out of poverty is by trusting the international financial institutions, the IFIs, and the two main ones are the IMF and the World Bank. Now these two organisations, they provide loans and financial assistance to countries in need. In return, these countries implement economic reforms according to the Washington Consensus. These are known as structural adjustment programs. They involve deregulation, privatization. Essentially, they involve letting the free market do its thing. The government keeps out of it, a laissez-faire approach, and trusting the free market. So deregulation, privatization. But there's a strong argument against the IMF and the World Bank. I'll just highlight a couple of points here. One view is that the structural adjustment programs are based on top-down reforms as opposed to sort of bottom-up community-based reforms, and therefore they might ignore the local needs of poorer countries. There's an argument in Latin America, in Chile, Argentina and Mexico, that the structural adjustment programs led to instability and economic disruption. If we look at two of the big success stories in recent years, China and India, their success seems to have been on their own terms, rather than based on IMF or World Bank support. Stiglitz has argued that the structural adjustment programs have exacerbated poverty, causing less spending on perhaps more essential services such as health and education. And it's argued that once opened up to global trade, which really is what the IMF and World Bank seek to do, they seek to open up these poorer countries to world trade, but it is argued that many countries simply can't compete on equal terms against rich countries which have all the infrastructure and which have the technology, the education to enable them to flourish in a free market. So this the argument of IFIs, well, there's a big case against the IFIs, and it remains very controversial. But we should note that since 2002, the one-size-fits-all model of the structural adjustment program has been replaced by a poverty reduction strategy, which it tends to offer more flexibility and recognition of local conditions. So the IFIs have tried to adapt to and respond to some of this criticism. Another big argument in terms of what countries need, how we can help poorer countries, is trade versus aid. Let's try and unpick what those terms mean. I guess in very, very simple terms, aid is handouts, it's giving food or medicine to poorer countries, whereas trade would be involving business and bringing these countries into the global sort of economic market. There's an economist called Easterly who suggested that $568 billion of aid has been given to Africa in the last 40 years with minimal impact. So that's I guess the essence of the argument, that aid hasn't proved to have been effective in helping poorer countries. I think we have, as often with these sort of two-way splits, trade versus aid, they're not quite as black and white as the word suggests. Aid is often tied in with trade packages, for example. It's also difficult to track the impact of aid. Wolfenson talked about what he called multiplied bureaucracy. Now, because so many organisations, charities, NGOs, individuals deliver aid, it can be difficult to actually track its impact. The US has pioneered targeted aid, which seeks to bypass national governments, and there's an increasing use of I would say, sort of business models or business approaches to aid, so target-based approaches involving accountability, transparency. For example, the Gates Foundation, Bill Gates, uses sort of business methods, business approaches to try to alleviate poverty. So this split between trade and aid has broken down somewhat, and it's not as simple, as the trade versus aid sort of title would suggest. If we have a quick look at pros and cons of trade and aid, so looking at the positives of trade, it's seen as sustainable, mutually beneficial. The buyer and the seller, in simple terms, only agree on an exchange if it's in their self-interest. So it's seen as mutually beneficial, enables poorer citizens to help themselves. It bypasses bureaucracy and corruption, and in doing so it removes a dependency culture. The negatives with trade is that it's inherently competitive, and it can be difficult for developing countries to compete with the rich world. Can lead to exploitation from richer nations. Growth can be slow, and it can be difficult to ensure that the profits of trade are distributed fairly, and in some poorer countries that engage in trade, it might just be a small group of rich businessmen who benefit. There's no way of ensuring that wealth is trickled down, whereas with aid you can distribute aid to whoever you think needs it the most. If we look at some of the pros of aid, we've just mentioned that it can be targeted quite carefully, it can provide instant relief, and it can be tightly managed, ensuring that it's fairly delivered. But the negatives of aid, we've got it can create a dependency culture, it can encourage or at least allow for corruption, it can be inefficient, it can be seen as unsustainable, especially in times of global recession as we're now seeing at the moment, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Two further approaches to development, two further solutions involve debt relief and then fair trade. Now, debt relief, you've got the notes on this, but it's the idea that rich countries should write off the debts of poorer countries, and that would enable the poor countries to to spend money on infrastructure and on health, education, as opposed to paying off their debts to rich countries. The argument for fair trade is a bit of a halfway house, like we see in the environment course with green capitalism. Fair trade is the idea that trade can be made to be fair, can be made to benefit those producers at the bottom, if we have regulation and if we protect their interests. Okay, so fair trade is a way of trying to protect the interests of those suppliers in poorer countries. So as we begin to close, let's just summarise the current approach to tackling poverty. There's this idea. Let's have a look. I think human rights have playing a bigger part in our understanding of poverty. And I think in the past there was this sense of, we called it ethical nationalism. That was the idea that we should help poorer countries in order to help ourselves. But that has been replaced by a view that everyone around the world, no matter what country they're in, has a right to economic success or economic development. So that view dominates. The Millennium Development Goals are very important. These were written up at the turn of the millennium, so 12 years ago. And these are indicative of a new approach to poverty. So they are ambitious, target-based goals rather than one-off sort of fundraisers. So there's a UN target as part of the Millennium Development Goals that rich countries should give 0.7% of GDP to poorer countries. Couple of problems. It can be tough to track this 0.7%. Say if America bombs a town in Pakistan and then rebuilds it, should it be allowed to use some of that aid budget to rebuild a town that it's destroyed itself? And also in times of recession, as we've seen in recent years in Europe, many countries decide to reduce their aid budgets. So the 0.7% target hasn't always been met, and even when it has been met, there's general agreement that it's not seen as sufficient to actually help those countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So none of these solutions or problems have been solved. The arguments carry on. A couple of things we haven't mentioned here are ways of measuring poverty. The key split here is absolute and relative, and then we haven't mentioned here corruption. Corruption could be seen as a necessary evil, something that rich countries or that NGOs just have to deal with, or it could be seen as a big barrier to growth. So we haven't talked too much about measuring poverty and corruption, but those are more peripheral, on the edge issues. Hopefully we've covered here some of the core central issues of poverty and development.